In a quiet village, a cunning thief called the Phantom steals priceless jewels, leaving only a white glove with a silver P. Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed old lady with a knack for secrets, arrives at Grand Haverford Hall, where the rich hide their lies. As thefts pile up, she spots clues in nervous hands and sly smiles. With her knitting needles clicking, Miss Marple sets a trap, unraveling a web of greed and betrayal to catch the phantom, a bold heiress, her pawn, and a shaky fence. Watch her outsmart them all in this thrilling game of wits. Chapter 1. The quiet village. In the tiny village of St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone's business, Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy parlor. Her knitting needles clicked softly, shaping a fluffy pink scarf. The room smelled of lavender and old books, with sunlight streaming through lace curtains. Outside, birds chirped, and the village hummed with its usual rhythm, shopkeepers sweeping doorsteps, children chasing a stray cat, and neighbors swapping stories over garden fences. But today, the talk wasn't about Mrs. Green's new hat or young Tommy's latest prank. No, the village buzzed with something bigger, something darker. A thief who was turning the whole county upside down. They called him the Phantom. Wasn't just any crook. This one was slick, stealing treasures from fancy houses, sparkling jewels, paintings worth more than the village itself, and silver so old it belonged in a museum. The newspapers couldn't stop talking about him. Every week, another headline screamed about a new heist. Scotland Yard, with all their big city detectives, was stumped. The Phantom didn't leave fingerprints or footprints. He didn't break windows or smash locks. All he left was a single white glove lying there like a taunt. It was as if he was laughing at everyone, saying, "Catch me if you can." Miss Marple's sharp eyes, hidden behind her gentle smile, took it all in. She didn't need to read the papers. The village was her newspaper. Every gossip, every whisper came to her doorstep. Mrs. Phipps, the baker's wife, swore the Phantom was a ghost who slipped through walls. Old Mr. Jenkins, who spent his days on a bench by the post office, said it was a rich man playing tricks for fun. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, thought it was foreigners, because who else would be so bold? Miss Marple listened, her needles never stopping. She didn't argue or nod. She just tucked each story away like threads in a quilt, waiting for the pattern to show itself. That afternoon, the parlor door flew open, and Mrs. Dolly Bantry burst in, her cheeks pink from hurrying. She clutched a crumpled newspaper. Her hat slightly crooked. "Jane, have you heard? It's happened again?" She gasped, flopping into a chair. "The Phantom! He's taken Lady Haverford's emerald necklace right out of her safe. The police are in a tizzy, and poor Lady Haverford's beside herself. They say the necklace was worth a fortune." Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap. "Oh, dear," she said softly, her voice as calm as a summer breeze. "That's dreadful. Tell me more, Dolly." Mrs. Bantry didn't need asking twice. She leaned forward, her eyes wide. "It was last night at Haverford Hall, that big mansion up the hill, you know, with the rose gardens and those snooty butlers. Lady Haverford wore the necklace to a party. Everyone saw it, green as a lime and sparkling like stars. She locked it in her safe before bed, same as always. But this morning, poof, gone. And there it was, that creepy white glove, right on the table. Not a scratch on the safe, not a window open. It's like magic, Jane." Miss Marple's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Magic, perhaps," she said, "or something much simpler. A thief who leaves a glove is either very sloppy or very smart." Mrs. Bantry blinked. Smart. Why would a smart thief leave anything behind? Miss Marple picked up her needles again. Click, click. Squeak to make us talk about the glove, Dolly. Not the safe, not the necklace, not the how or the why jest. The glove. It's a trick, like a magician waving a wand so you don't see his other hand. Mrs. Bantry stared, her mouth open. "Jane Marple, you're wasted in this village. You should be running Scotland Yard." Miss Marple chuckled. a soft sound like rustling leaves. "Oh, I'm quite happy here, Dolly. The village has plenty to teach, if you know how to listen." Listen, she did. Over the next few days, St. Mary Mead was a hive of rumors. The milkman said he'd seen a strange car near Haverford Hall the night of the theft, but it was too dark to be sure. The postmistress, Miss Weatherby, whispered that Lady Haverford's nephew, Charles, was in debt and always hanging around the mansion. The butcher's boy swore he'd heard a dog barking wildly that night, though no one else mentioned it. Miss Marple sipped her tea and let the stories pile up. She didn't write them down. She didn't need to. Her mind was sharper than any notebook, sorting facts like a librarian shelving books. She thought about the glove. A white glove wasn't something you'd find in any old shop. Sounded fancy, maybe even custom made. And why leave it to scare people, to show off? Or was it a mistake, a tiny crack in the Phantom's perfect plan? Miss Marple's fingers paused, just for a second. Mistakes were rare with someone this clever, but not impossible. People, even master criminals, were still people. And people, as Miss Marple knew better than anyone, always left clues not in fingerprints or muddy boots, but in the way they acted, the things they said, habits they couldn't hide. Her thoughts were interrupted by the postman, who brought a letter. With a fancy crest, it was from Sir Henry Clithering, an old friend and a retired Scotland Yard bigwig. Miss Marple opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. Sir Henry was inviting her to a weekend at Haverford Hall, the county's top folks. "We'll be there," he wrote, "and we're all talking about this Phantom business. I'd value your thoughts, Jane. You see things we miss." Miss Marple folded the letter and tapped it against her chin. Haverford Hall, where the necklace was stolen. A house full of rich people, nervous servants, and secrets. It was the perfect place to watch and listen. She smiled to herself. Sir Henry was no fool. He knew her quiet ways hid a mind like a steel trap. If the Phantom was connected to that house, she'd find the thread to pull. She packed a small suitcase, tucking in her knitting and a sensible shawl. The village would talk, of course. Miss Marple off to a grand house. They'd say, "Ugh." She up to let them talk. Gossip was a tool, and she knew how to use it. She locked her cottage door. She glanced at the roses climbing the wall. They were pretty, but they had thorns. People were like that, too lovely on the outside, sharp underneath. The Phantom, whoever he was, would be no different. The train to Haverford Hall was slow, giving Miss Marple time to think. She sat by the window, watching fields roll by, her hands busy with her scarf. The Phantom's crimes weren't random. Jewels, paintings, silver, they were all things you could sell, but not easily. You'd need connections, buyers who didn't ask questions. That meant the Phantom wasn't working alone. A thief this bold had helped maybe a fence to sell the goods, maybe a servant to unlock a door, and the glove. It was a signature, like an artist signing a painting. The Phantom wanted people to know it was him. Pride, Miss Marple thought. Pride could trip even the cleverest crook. When the train reached Haverford Station, a driver in a smart uniform was waiting. He tipped his cap and took her suitcase, saying little. The drive to Haverford Hall wound through green hills, past stone walls and grazing sheep. The mansion came into view, all tall windows and gray stone, with roses spilling over the gardens. It looked like a postcard, but Miss Marple knew better. Pretty houses hid ugly truths dotted the front door. A butler bowed and led her inside. The hall was grand marble floors, chandeliers, and paintings of stern old men. Voices drifted from a room nearby, loud with worry and wine. Sir Henry greeted her warmly, his mustache twitching with a smile. "Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes. Come meet the crowd." The drawing room was packed with fancy folks. Lady Haverford, the necklace's owner, sat by the fireplace, her face pale but her chin high. She was older than Miss Marple, with diamonds on her fingers and a voice that cut like glass. Her nephew Charles hovered nearby, a handsome young man with restless eyes. He laughed too loudly, his hands fidgeting. Mr. Grayson, an art dealer, stood by a window, his thin face twitching every time someone mentioned the phantom. Miss Lavinia Price, a young heiress with a sharp tongue, flitted around, her dress glittering like a peacock's tail. Miss Marple settled into a corner, her knitting in her hands. She looked like any old lady, harmless and quiet. But her eyes missed nothing. Charles's shoes were polished, but one lace was frayed. Grayson's cufflinks were gold, but his shirt was slightly wrinkled. Miss Price's smile was bright, but her fingers gripped her glass too tightly. Small things, but small things told stories. Dinner was a lavish affair: roast beef, creamy potatoes, and wine that cost more than Miss Marple's cottage. The talk was all about the phantom. Lady Haverford clutched her napkin, saying, "It's a disgrace. The police do nothing while we're robbed blind." Charles joked that the phantom must be a magician, but his laugh was nervous. Grayson said little, his eyes darting to the door. Miss Price suggested the thief was someone they knew, which made everyone shift in their seats. Sir Henry leaned toward Miss Marple. "What do you make of it, Jane?" he asked quietly. She smiled, her needles clicking. "It's early days, Henry, but I think our thief is closer than we know." After dinner, Sir Henry shared a new clue with a few trusted guests, including Miss Marple. The phantom's gloves weren't ordinary. They were made of fine leather with a tiny P stitched in silver thread. "Custom work," Sir Henry said. "We're tracing the maker, but it's a start." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A P could mean phantom, but it could also be a name: Peter, Philip, or even a woman like Patricia. Or it could be a red herring meant to mislead. She glanced at Charles, who was charming Miss Price with a story. His hands, she noticed, were small for a man's. Interesting. As the evening ended, Miss Marple climbed the grand staircase to her room. The house was quiet now, but it felt alive with secrets. Somewhere in these halls, the phantom's trail began. She didn't know how yet, but she would find it. She always did. In her room, she sat by the window, knitting in the moonlight. The scarf grew longer, stitch by stitch. Below, the gardens were dark, but a shadow moved near the roses. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. It was too far to see clearly, but it was enough to make her wonder. She tucked her knitting away and blew out the candle. Tomorrow, she'd start pulling threads. The phantom was clever, but Miss Marple was cleverer. And in St. Mary Mead, she'd learned one truth above all: no one could hide forever. Chapter 2. The Invitation. The morning sun spilled over Haverford Hall, turning the rose gardens into a patchwork of pink and gold. Miss Jane Marple sat by her bedroom window, her knitting needles clicking as she worked on her pink scarf. The house was stirring. Maids scurried with trays, and the smell of bacon drifted up from the kitchen. But Miss Marple's mind wasn't on breakfast. She was thinking about the shadow she'd seen in the garden last night. It was quick, gone in a blink, but it lingered in her thoughts like a loose thread. Shadows didn't move on their own, and in a house touched by the phantom, nothing was innocent. She dressed in her usual sensible clothes: a gray skirt, a white blouse, and a lavender cardigan that smelled faintly of mothballs. Her hat, plain but neat, sat on the dresser. She didn't fuss with mirrors or powders. Her sharp blue eyes and quick mind were her real tools. As she pinned her hat, she replayed Sir Henry's letter in her head. He'd invited her here to Haverford Hall, the very place where Lady Haverford's emerald necklace had vanished. A weekend with the county's richest folks, all buzzing about the phantom. "Your insight, Jane," he'd written, "cuts through the fog." Sir Henry was clever, but he knew Miss Marple saw what others missed not in grand clues, but in the small human things: a glance, a fidget, a word said too quickly. Downstairs, the dining room was a bustle of clinking china and low voices. The guests from last night were there, their faces a mix of worry and false cheer. Lady Haverford sat at the head of the table, her silver hair perfect, her lips tight. She stirred her tea with a tiny spoon, but her eyes were far away, probably on the empty spot in her safe. Her nephew Charles slouched beside her, buttering toast with a lazy grin. He was handsome, with dark curls and a charm that felt practiced, like an actor playing a part. Across from him, Mr. Grayson, the art dealer, picked at his eggs, his thin fingers twitching. His suit was expensive, but his cuffs were frayed, a detail Miss Marple noted with a tilt of her head. Miss Lavinia Price, the heiress, sparkled in a green dress, her laugh sharp as glass. She tossed her head, making her earrings dance, but her eyes darted to every face, as if counting allies. Miss Marple slipped into a chair near Sir Henry, who gave her a warm nod. "Sleep well, Jane?" he asked, passing her the marmalade. "Well enough," she said, her voice soft, though the house has a restless feel. "Don't you think?" Sir Henry's mustache twitched. "You're not wrong. It's phantom business." "Has everyone jumpy?" "Even the servants are whispering." Breakfast was lavish crisp bacon, fluffy eggs, and scones warm from the oven. But the talk was all about the phantom. Lady Haverford's voice cut through the chatter. "It's a scandal," she said, her spoon clinking hard against her cup. "My necklace, gone. And the police, useless. They poke around, ask silly questions, and find nothing. I want my emeralds back." Charles chuckled, leaning back. "Maybe the phantom's a ghost ant. Slipping through walls? Poof! No lock can." "Stop him," Lady Haverford glared. "Don't be foolish, Charles. Ghosts don't wear gloves." Miss Marple spread marmalade on her scone, her eyes on Charles. His joke was light, but his hands fidgeted, twisting a napkin into knots. Nervous, she thought, or hiding something. She glanced at Grayson, who'd gone still at the word gloves. His fork hovered, then dropped with a clink. "Its price?" Meanwhile, leaned toward Charles, her smile sly. "Maybe it's not a ghost," she said. "Maybe it's someone right here sipping tea with us." The room went quiet. Spoons paused, eyes flicked around. Lady Haverford snorted. "Don't be absurd, Lavinia." "My guests are above suspicion." Miss Price raised an eyebrow. "Are they? Thieves can wear silk as well as rags." Grayson coughed, his face pale. Charles laughed, but it sounded forced. Miss Marple took a small bite of her scone, her mind sorting the moment like cards. Miss Price's words were bold, almost a challenge. Was she stirring trouble for fun? Or did she know something? And Grayson's cough fear? Or just a crumb? Small things, but they piled up. After breakfast, Sir Henry invited Miss Marple for a walk in the gardens. The air was cool, scented with roses and damp earth. Gravel crunched under their feet as they strolled past neatly trimmed hedges. Sir Henry lit his pipe, puffing thoughtfully. "Jane," he said, "I didn't ask you here just for tea and gossip. This phantom's a problem. He's hit 5 houses. In 3 months, each job cleaner than the last. No forced doors, no broken windows, just that blasted glove." Miss Marple nodded, her scarf trailing in her hands. "The glove is curious, Henry. Custom made, you said, with a P stitched on it?" "Exactly." Sir Henry puffed again. "We're checking tailors, but it's slow work. The glove's our only lead, and it feels like he's mocking us with it." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps he wants us to chase the glove and miss the real trick. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a boy who stole apples and left a feather behind. Everyone talked about the feather, not the orchard gate he left unlatched." Sir Henry chuckled. "You and your village stories. But you're right, tits, a distraction. The question is, what's he hiding?" They paused by a fountain, water splashing softly. Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the house, where a maid was shaking out a rug. "Tell me about the guests." She said Lady Haverford, for instance. Sir Henry shrugged. "Rich, proud, and stubborn. Her husband died years ago, left her a fortune in jewels. She loved showing them off. Losing that necklace hit her hard, but she's tougher than she looks. And Charles, her nephew, Bit of a drifter. Lives off her generosity. Though I hear he's in debt. Charming, but slippery. Always got a story to explain where he's been. Miss Marple nodded. Mr. Grayson, art dealer. Knows everyone. In the trade, bit twitchy, but that's his way. He's been advising Lady Haverford on her paintings, which makes him a suspect, I suppose. If the Phantom's selling stolen art, Grayson would know the buyers. And Miss Price, Sir Henry, grinned. A firecracker. Inherited a pile of money and spends it like water. Sharp tongue, sharper mind. She's got no reason to steal. But she loves drama. It wouldn't surprise me if she's poking her nose into this for fun. Miss Marple's needles clicked, though she wasn't knitting now. It's a lively group, she said. Plenty of secrets to go around. They walked back to the house, where the day unfolded in a whirl of polite chatter. Lunch was cold ham and salad served on a terrace overlooking the hills. The guests mingled, their voices bright but strained. Miss Marple sat with a cup of tea, watching. Charles flirted with Miss Price, who laughed but kept her distance. Grayson talked to Lady Haverford. About a new painting, his hands waving nervously. A servant dropped a plate, and everyone jumped, as if expecting the Phantom to leap from the bushes in the afternoon. Miss Marple joined the ladies for cards in the drawing room. The men played billiards, their laughter echoing down the hall. Lady Haverford dealt the cards with a snap, her rings flashing. "I won't let this thief ruin my weekend," she said. "We'll carry on, gloves or no gloves." Miss Price smirked. "Maybe we should all wear gloves. Can make it harder for him to stand out." Lady Haverford frowned. "Don't be flippant, Lavinia. It's not a game, isn't it?" Miss Price shuffled her cards. Someone's playing, and they're winning. Miss Marple laid down a card, her face mild. "Games have rules," she said. "Even thieves follow patterns. In my village, a boy who took eggs always struck on market day, when folks were distracted. Find the pattern, and you find the thief." Lady Haverford snorted. "This isn't about eggs, Miss Marple." Miss Marple agreed, but people are people, high or low. Miss Price's eyes gleamed. "You're a sly one, Miss Marple. I bet you've got a theory already." Miss Marple smiled, her needles in her lap. "Oh, I'm just an old lady who likes puzzles." The card game went on, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She thought about Charles's debts, Grayson's, Twitch, Miss Price's sharp words. And the glove always, the glove. It was a clue, but not the whole story. The Phantom was careful, but no one was perfect. A slip, a habit, a moment of carelessness. That's what she needed. Dinner was grander than breakfast. With candlelight bouncing off crystal glasses, the talk turned to the Phantom again, fueled by wine and fear. Charles spun a tale about a thief he'd read about who climbed walls like a spider. Grayson muttered about black market art, then went quiet when Lady Haverford glared. Miss Price suggested a trap, put out a fake jewel, and catch the thief red-handed. Unless, she added, he's too smart for that. Sir Henry raised his glass. It's catching the Phantom, whoever he is. Miss Marple sipped her water, her eyes on the table. Charles's hands, small and quick, toyed with a spoon. Grayson's napkin was crumpled, as if he'd been twisting. Miss Price's earrings caught the light, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Small things piling up. After dinner, the guests moved to the library, where a fire crackled. Sir Henry pulled Miss Marple aside. "Anything, Jane?" he asked, his voice low. She folded her knitting. "Not yet, Henry, but I'm watching. Charles is nervous, Grayson's hiding something, and Miss Price is too clever for her own good. And that glovet's not just a clue. It's a message." Sir Henry nodded. "Keep watching. If anyone can crack this, it's you." The evening wound down, and Miss Marple climbed the stairs to her room. The house was quiet, but the air felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. She locked her door and sat by the window, her knitting. In her hands, the garden was dark, but she watched anyway. No shadows tonight, But that didn't mean they weren't there. She thought about the phantom. A thief this bold wasn't just after money. It was pride, showmanship, the thrill of outsmarting everyone. But pride made people sloppy. In St. Mary Mead, she'd seen it time and again, a liar who'd talked too much, a cheat who forgot a detail. The phantom was human, and humans left tracks. Even if they were only in the way they laughed or tied their shoes. Miss Marple's needles clicked, the scarf growing longer. Tomorrow, she'd dig deeper. She'd talk to the servants, watch the guests, listen for the one wrong note in the house's song. The phantom was here, or close. She could feel it, like a prickle on her neck. And when she found him, it wouldn't be with a chase or a shout. It would be quiet, simple, the way a single stitch could unravel a whole sweater. She blew out her candle and went to bed, her mind still turning. The game was on, and Miss Jane Marple never lost. Chapter 3. The second theft. The second morning at Haverford Hall dawned gray, with clouds heavy over the rose gardens. Miss Jane Marple woke early, her knitting neatly folded on the bedside table. She'd slept lightly, her mind buzzing with the phantom's glove, Charles's fidgety hands, and the shadows she'd seen or thought she'd seen in the garden. The house felt like a puzzle box full of hidden catches and false bottoms. Today, she'd nudge it open a little more. She dressed in her usual plain clothes, a navy skirt, a cream blouse, and her lavender cardigan. Her hat, sensible as always, sat ready for the day. From her window, she watched a gardener rake leaves, his movements slow and steady. Nothing suspicious there, but she noted his face anyway. In St. Mary Mead, she'd learned that clues hid in the ordinary. Late delivery, a shopkeeper's nervous smile. Haverford Hall was grander, but people were the same. Downstairs, the dining room was quieter than yesterday. The guests sipped coffee and nibbled toast, their faces tired. Lady Haverford sat stiffly, her eyes red, as if she hadn't slept. Charles yawned, his charm dimmed by the early hour. Mr. Grayson, the art dealer, stirred his tea too fast, his spoon clinking loudly. Miss Lavinia Price, in a bright yellow dress, seemed the only one awake, her sharp eyes flicking from face to face. Sir Henry Clithering caught Miss Marple's eye and nodded. A silent question. Anything new? She gave a tiny shake of her head. Not yet, but soon. Breakfast was eggs and kippers, with fresh rolls and jam. The talk was subdued, mostly about the weather and the county fair. No one mentioned the phantom, as if saying his name might summon him. Miss Marple spread jam on her roll, listening. Silence was as telling as chatter. Lady Haverford's tight lips, Charles's slumped shoulders, Grayson's twitching fingers. They all spoke of worry, or guilt, or both. After breakfast, Miss Marple slipped into the morning room where the ladies gathered to write letters or read. She took a corner chair, her knitting in her hands, and watched. Miss Price was writing, her pen scratching fast, but she kept glancing at the door. Lady Haverford flipped through a magazine, not reading a word. A maid, young and nervous, brought tea, her hands shaking as she poured. Miss Marple smiled at her. "Thank you, dear. Been here long." The maid, whose name was Elsie, blushed. "Only a month, ma'am? It's a good place, but—" she hesitated, then whispered, "Everyone's so jumpy since the necklace went." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "I imagine so. Seen? Anything odd, Elsie? Strangers about, or doors left open?" Elsie shook her head. "No, ma'am. But the other night I heard footsteps in the hall, late. Thought it was nothing, but—" She trailed off, glancing at Lady Haverford, who was glaring at her magazine. "Thank you, Elsie," Miss Marple said softly. Footsteps weren't much, but they were something. She tucked the detail away, like a button in a sewing box. The morning dragged on, with the men off shooting in the woods, and the ladies scattered. Miss Marple wandered the house, her steps slow, her eyes sharp. The halls were lined with portraits, stern men and pale women, their eyes following her. She paused by a locked door, marked "Private." A servant's door, perhaps, or a study. She made a mental note to ask Sir Henry about it, at lunch. The mood was lighter, with cold chicken and fruit tarts on the terrace. Charles told a funny story about a horse race, making Miss Price laugh. Grayson talked about a new gallery in London, his voice too loud. Lady Haverford barely ate, her fork pushing peas around her plate. Miss Marple sipped lemonade, watching Charles's hands. They were small, quick, and restless, twisting a napkin. Again, she thought of the glove with its silver P. Could it fit those hands? Maybe, after lunch, she joined Sir Henry in the library, where he was reading reports from Scotland Yard. "Any news, Henry?" she asked, settling into a leather chair. He sighed, rubbing his mustache. Nothing solid. The gloves from a tailor. In London, but the order was anonymous, paid in cash. The Phantom's careful, Jane. Too careful. Miss Marple's needles clicked. No one's that careful, Henry. In my village, a man who stole pies always wiped his shoes. But he forgot. The flower on his cuffs. The Phantom's got a flaw. We just haven't seen it. Sir Henry chuckled. You make it sound simple. It's never simple, she said. But it's always human. The afternoon passed quietly, with tea in the drawing room and more. Card games. Miss Marple watched Miss Price, who was whispering to Charles, her hand on his arm. Grayson sat alone, staring out a window, his face pale. Lady Haverford snapped at a servant for spilling a drop of tea. The house was a pot ready to boil over. That night, dinner was a grand affaros lamb, creamy potatoes, and wine that sparkled in the candlelight. The guests dressed up, their jewels and silk hiding their nerves. Miss Marple wore her usual gray dress, her only ornament a small brooch. She sat between Sir Henry and Miss Price, listening as the talk turned to the Phantom again. Lady Haverford's voice was sharp. I've had enough of this nonsense. I'm doubling the locks on my safe. Charles grinned. Locks won't stop him, Aunt. He's a wizard. Stop it, Charles, she snapped. It's not funny. Miss Price leaned forward, her earrings glinting. Maybe we should hire a detective. Someone clever, like Miss Marple. Her smile was teasing, but her eyes were hard. Miss Marple smiled back. Her face smiled. Oh, I'm no detective, dear. Just an old lady who notices things. Grayson coughed, his glass clinking against the table. Noticing things can be dangerous, he muttered. The table went quiet. Sir Henry cleared his throat. Let's not get carried away. The police are on it. Dinner ended, and the guests moved to the ballroom for music. A pianist played soft tunes, and a few couples danced. Miss Marple sat by a window, her knitting in her lap, watching. Charles danced with Miss Price, his steps smooth, but his eyes darting. Grayson stood by the punch bowl, his hands in his pockets. Lady Haverford sat with Sir Henry, her fan flicking like an angry cat's tail. Then it happened. A scream tore through the music, high and sharp. The pianist stopped, and everyone froze. It was Lady Haverford, standing by the staircase, her face white. My tiara, she gasped. It's gone. The room erupted. Guests crowded around, servants ran in, and Sir Henry took charge. Stay calm, he barked. Where was it? Lady Haverford clutched her chest. In my bedroom, locked in my jewel case. I checked it before dinner. Now it's gone. Henry led the way upstairs with Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock, who'd arrived that evening, and the guests following. Lady Haverford's bedroom was grand, with silk curtains and a four-poster bed. The jewel case, a small silver box, sat on her dresser unlocked, empty. And there, beside it, was a white glove, its silver P gleaming in the lamplight. Inspector Craddock, a young man with a serious face, examined the room. No forced entry, he said. Windows shut, door locked, same as the necklace. Lady Haverford sank onto a chair, fanning herself. This is intolerable. My sapphire tiara? Gone. It's worth thousands. Charles put a hand on her shoulder. We'll find it, Aunt. The Phantom can't keep this up. Miss Price raised an eyebrow. Can't he? He's done it twice here. Grayson said nothing, his eyes on the glove. Miss Marple stepped closer, her shawl slipping slightly. She looked at the glove, then at the jewel case. No scratches, no marks. The lock was simple, easy to pick if you knew how. She glanced at Charles, who was whispering to his aunt. His hands, small and quick, were still. Too still. Inspector Craddock questioned everyone. Where were they during dinner? After? Alibis were shaky. Charles said he'd been in the ballroom, but no one could confirm it. Miss Price claimed she'd been with Lady Haverford, but only for part of the time. Grayson said he'd stepped out for air, alone. Lady Haverford had been in her room before dinner, but not since. The servants swore they'd seen nothing, though. Elsie the maid looked ready to cry. Miss Marple listened, her needles idle. The phantom had struck under their noses, bold as brass. The glove was a taunt, but it was also a risk. Why leave it? To scare them, to prove he could. Or was it a mistake? A crack in his armor? She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a thief, who took chickens, always struck at dusk when farmers were eating. Cadams. The phantom had won, and she'd find it. The search began. Servants checked every room, guests emptied pockets, and Craddock examined the glove, which was identical to the first fine leather silver pea. Miss Marple watched the guests. Charles stayed close to his aunt, his face worried but his eyes sharp. Grayson hovered by the door, his hands twitching. Miss Price watched everyone, her smile gone. Lady Haverford wept, but her tears seemed more angry than sad. Sir Henry pulled Miss Marple aside. "Jane, this is madness. He's here, in this house. But how?" Miss Marple folded her knitting. "He's clever, Henry, but he's human. The glove's a clue, but it's not the whole story. Look at the people. Charles is too eager to help. Grayson's scared. Miss Price knows more than she says." Sir Henry nodded. "And the tiara. It's not small. He'd need a place to hide it, or a way to move it," Miss Marple said. "In my village, a boy hid stolen apples in a hay cart. We need to think like him." Search found nothing. No tiara, no tools, no clues. The guests returned to the ballroom, shaken. Inspector Craddock stayed upstairs, dusting for prints. Miss Marple sat by the window, her eyes on the garden. The clouds had parted, and moonlight lit the roses. No shadows tonight, but the house was full of them. She thought about the glove. Custom-made, expensive. Not something you'd lose by accident. The P could be a name, Philip, Patricia, or even Price. Or it could be a trick meant to mislead. She thought of Charles's hands, Grayson's fear, Miss Price's sly smile. And Elsie's footsteps, late at night. Small things, but they were building a picture. The night ended with no answers. Miss Marple climbed to her room, her steps slow. The house was quiet, but it hummed with secrets. The phantom was close. She could feel it. Tomorrow, she'd talk to Elsie, watch Charles, and poke at Grayson's nerves. The tiara was gone, but it wasn't far. Thieves, even clever ones, left traces. In St. Mary Mead, she'd caught a liar by the mud on his boots. Here, it would be something else's word, a look, a glove. She locked her door and sat by the window, her knitting in her hands. The scarf grew longer, stitch by stitch. Outside, the garden was still. But inside, the game was on, and Miss Jane Marple was ready to play. Chapter 4. The tailor's secret. The third morning at Haverford Hall was crisp, with a breeze rattling the windows. Miss Jane Marple woke before dawn, her mind already turning over the phantom's latest strike. The sapphire tiara, gone from a locked jewel case, and another white glove left behind, its silver pea winking in the lamplight. The house was a nest of nerves, and she could feel the threads of the mystery tightening. Today she'd tug at one. Charles, with his small hands and nervous charm, was a loose stitch in the phantom's plan. She dressed in her usual plain outfit, a gray skirt, a white blouse, and her lavender cardigan, soft from years of wear. Her sensible hat sat on the dresser, ready for a trip she'd planned. The village near Haverford Hall had a tailor, and tailors knew gloves. If the phantom's gloves were custom-made, as Sir Henry said, the tailor might know who ordered them. Miss Marple's knitting lay folded, her pink scarf a little longer. She slipped her needles into her bag. Not for knitting, but for show people talked more when they thought you were just a harmless old lady downstairs. The dining room was grim. The guests ate in near silence, their forks scraping plates. Lady Haverford's face was like stone, her eyes fixed on her coffee. Charles tried a weak joke about the weather, but no one laughed. Mr. Grayson, the art dealer, pushed his bacon around, his hands shaking. Miss Lavinia Price in a red dress that screamed for attention sipped tea and watched everyone, her lips curved in a half-smile. Sir Henry caught Miss Marple's eye and raised an eyebrow. She nodded slightly. They'd talk later. Breakfast was simple toast. Eggs and fruit, but it tasted flat, as if the phantom had stolen the flavor too. Inspector Craddock, who'd stayed overnight, joined them, his notebook open. He asked a few questions about the tiara, but the answers were the same. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. Miss Marple listened, her eyes on Charles. He was too quick to agree, too eager to help. In St. Mary Mead, she'd known a boy who stole eggs and always offered to search the hen house. Guilt or a way to steer the hunt. After breakfast, Miss Marple found Sir Henry in the hall. "I'm going to the village, Henry," she said, her voice soft. "A little errand." "I'll be back by lunch." He frowned. "The village. Jane, this isn't the time for shopping." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Not shopping, Henry. Listening. Villages talk, and I know how to hear them." He chuckled. "You're a wonder. Be careful, though. The phantom's bold, and we don't know who's helping him." She nodded and headed out, her shawl around her shoulders. The driver, a quiet man named Tom, took her to the village in a rattling car. The road wound through green hills, past sheep and stone walls. The village was small, like St. Mary Mead, with a church, a pub, and a row of shops. Miss Marple asked Tom to stop by the tailor's, a narrow store with a sign reading Hobson's Son, fine stitching. Inside, the shop smelled of wool and polish. Bolts of fabric lined the walls, and a bell jingled as she entered. Mr. Hobbs, stooped man with thick glasses, looked up from his counter. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Need a dress mended." Miss Marple smiled, setting her bag on the counter. "Not today, Mr. Hobbs. I'm visiting Haverford Hall, and I thought a new shawl might be nice. Something simple in blue." He nodded, pulling out a sample book. "Plenty of blues here. Cashmere, maybe." They chatted as he showed her fabrics, his voice warm but guarded. Miss Marple kept her tone light, asking about the village, the weather, the news. Then, as if it were nothing, she said, "I hear you make fine gloves, too." A friend mentioned a lovely pair, white leather with a little P stitched on them. Mr. Hobbs froze, his hand on the sample book. His glasses slipped down his nose, and he pushed them up, his fingers trembling. "Gloves," said, his voice high. "I make gloves, sure, but nothing special. Who's your friend?" "Oh, just someone at the hall," Miss Marple said, her eyes soft but sharp. "They thought the gloves were yours. Custom work, they said. Very elegant." Mr. Hobbs swallowed, his face pale. I did make a few pairs, maybe." "White leather." "You say with a P, yes," she said, leaning forward. "They sounded unique. Do you make many like that?" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. "Not many. Gentlemen ordered them. Oh, a month ago. Paid cash. Wanted them. Quick. 3 pairs, white leather, with a silver P on the cuff. Didn't say why." Miss Marple's needles clicked in her bag, though she didn't touch them. A gentleman. How interesting. Was he young, old, tall? Mr. Hobbs rubbed his neck. Youngish. I'd say not tall, slim. Dark hair. Wore a nice coat, but his shoes were scuffed. Didn't give a name. Said it was for a play or some such. Her heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. A play. How clever. Did he come back for more? "No, ma'am. Just the once." I thought it odd, but money's money. He looked at her, his eyes worried. It's about that phantom business, ain't it? The gloves and the papers. Miss Marple smiled, folding her hands. Oh, I'm sure. It's nothing. Just curious. Thank you, Mr. Hobbs. I'll take that cashmere shawl in sky blue. He rang her up, his hand still shaky. As she left, she glanced back. Mr. Hobbs was wiping his brow, staring at the counter. She'd rattled him, and that was enough for now. The gentleman he described sounded like Charles Slim, dark-haired, young. Scuffed shoes fit a man in debt, living off his aunt's money. But was Charles the phantom, or just a piece of the puzzle? Back in the car, Tom drove slowly, giving her time to think. The gloves were a link, but not the whole chain. Charles ordered them. Why leave them at the crimes? To frame someone else? To play a part? Or was he a pawn following orders? In St. Mary Mead, a girl who stole ribbons turned out to be covering for her brother. People hid things for all sorts of reasons. Love, fear, money. At Haverford Hall. Lunch was wet and cold beef, pickles, and apple pie. The guests were tense, their voices low. Lady Haverford barely spoke, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. Charles was absent, which made Miss Marple's ears prick. Grayson muttered about leaving early, his eyes on his plate. Miss Price teased Inspector Craddock about the police's failures, her laugh sharp. Sir Henry pulled Miss Marple aside as they left the table. Well, Jane, what did the village say? She told him about Mr. Hobbs and the gloves, keeping her voice low. The man who ordered them matches Charles, she said. But it's too neat, Henry. The phantom's not so careless. Sir Henry nodded, his mustache twitching. Charles is slippery, but is he that bold? We need more. I'll watch him, she said. And Grayson. He's nervous, and nervous men talk. The afternoon was quiet, with rain keeping everyone inside. Miss Marple joined the ladies for tea in the drawing room, her knitting in her hands. Lady Haverford complained about the police, her voice sharp. Miss Price played cards with a maid, her eyes darting to the door. Grayson sat by a window, pretending to read. Miss Marple chatted with Elsie, the nervous maid from yesterday. Busy day, Elsie? She asked, her tone gentle. Elsie nodded, pouring tea. Awful, ma'am. Everyone's snapping, and the police keep asking questions. I don't know nothing, but they stare like I do. Miss Marple smiled. It's hard, dear. Those footsteps you heard, when was that? Elsie blushed. 8? Maybe before last, ma'am? After midnight. I was up fetching water for Mrs. Bantry. Heard steps in the west hall near the private rooms. Thought it was a guest, but it was so quiet. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. Probably nothing. Thank you, Elsie. Footsteps in the west hall near the private rooms. Lady Haverford's bedroom was there, where the tiara was stolen. Charles's room was nearby, too. Another thread, thin but strong. At dinner, Charles reappeared, his charm back in place. He told a story about a fox he'd seen, making Miss Price laugh. Grayson drank too much wine, his face flushed. Lady Haverford ate little, her eyes on her nephew. Miss Marple watched her soup untouched. Charles's hands were quick, slipping a spoon into his pocket, then out again. A habit or practice? Grayson's eyes kept flicking to Charles as if waiting for something. Miss Price's laugh was too loud, her fingers drumming the table. After dinner, Sir Henry gathered a few guests in the library, including Miss Marple. Inspector Craddock shared news. The tiara's lock was picked, not forced, by someone skilled. The phantom knows locks, Craddock said, and he's fast. The theft happened between dinner and the scream less than an hour. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting in her lap. A short window, she said. Someone who knew the house and Lady Haverford's habits. Craddock frowned. That points to a guest or a servant, or both. Miss Marple said softly, It's in my village. A thief worked with a maid to steal silver. One to open the door, one to take the goods. Sir Henry's eyes narrowed. You think Charles has help? I think, she said, that the phantom is more than one person. The gloves, the locks, the timing is too much for one pair of hands. The talk went on, but Miss Marple's mind was racing. Charles, with his debts and small hands, fit the gloves. But Grayson's fear and Miss Price's slyness didn't fit a lone thief, and Elsie's footsteps someone moving at night unseen. The phantom was a team, she was sure, but who was the leader? The evening ended with music in the ballroom, but the mood was heavy. Miss Marple sat by a window, her eyes on the guests. Charles danced with Miss Price, his steps light but his face tense. Grayson stood alone, his hands in his pockets. Lady Haverford retired early, her face pale. Sir Henry joined Miss Marple, his voice low. "You're on to something, Jane. I can see it." She smiled, her needles idle. "Just threads, Henry. But they're coming together." She climbed to her room, her steps slow. The house was quiet, but it hummed with secrets. The glove, the footsteps, Charles's hands, they were pieces of a quilt, and she was stitching it together. Tomorrow she'd poke at Grayson, talk to Elsie again, and watch Miss Price. The phantom was clever, but he was human. In St. Mary Mead she'd caught a cheat by the sugar on his fingers. Here it would be something else, a glance, a lie, a glove. She locked her door and sat by the window, her knitting in her hands. The scarf grew longer, stitch by stitch. Outside the rain had stopped, and the garden was dark. No shadows tonight, but they were there, waiting. The phantom was close, and Miss Jane Marple was closer. Chapter 5. The art dealer's game the fourth morning at Haverford Hall was damp, with mist curling around the rose gardens like a ghost. Miss Jane Marple woke early, her mind sharp despite the restless night. The phantom's shadow loomed larger. After the tiara theft and her visit to the tailor had tightened the knot, Charles, with his small hands and scuffed shoes, was tied to the gloves. But he wasn't the whole story. Today she'd turn her eyes to Mr. Grayson, the twitchy art dealer whose nervous glances and frayed cuffs hinted at secrets in St. Mary Mead. She'd learned that fear was a crack in any facade. And Grayson was crumbling. She dressed in her usual plain clothes, a navy skirt, a cream blouse, and her lavender cardigan, soft and familiar. Her sensible hat stayed on the dresser. Today was for indoor work, watching and listening. Her knitting, the pink scarf half done, went into her bag. The needles weren't just for wool, they were a prop, making her look harmless while her eyes caught every slip. She glanced out the window where the mist hid the hills. The house felt like a trap, and Grayson was a mouse sniffing the cheese. Downstairs, the dining room was heavy with tension. The guests ate in near silence, their knives scraping plates. Lady Haverford sat rigid, her coffee untouched, her face pale as chalk. Charles forced a smile, buttering toast with shaky hands. Miss Lavinia Price, in a violet dress, sipped tea and watched everyone, her eyes sharp as pins. Grayson was late, his chair empty, which made Miss Marple's fingers itch. Sir Henry Clithering caught her eye and nodded slightly. They'd talk soon. Breakfast was bacon, eggs, and rolls, but the food sat heavy. Spilett, the hall joined them, his notebook out. He asked about the tiara again, but the answers were tired. No one saw anything. No one knew anything. Miss Marple spread jam on her roll, her eyes on Charles. He was too quiet today. His charm dimmed. Was it guilt or fear? She glanced at Miss Price, whose smile was sly, as if she knew a secret. Grayson slipped in halfway through, muttering an apology. His tie was crooked, his face flushed. Miss Marple noted it, her mind filing it away like a letter in a drawer. After breakfast, she followed the ladies to the morning room, where they wrote letters or read. She took a corner chair, her knitting in her hands, and watched. Miss Price was sketching, her pencils scratching fast, but her eyes kept flicking to Grayson, who joined them. He sat by a window, pretending to read a newspaper, his fingers twitching. Lady Haverford flipped through a book, her lips tight. A Medelzi, The nervous one brought tea, her hand steady today. Miss Marple smiled at her. "Feeling better, Elsie?" Elsie nodded. "Pouring a bit, ma'am. It's just everyone's so cross. And the police keep staring." "They do," Miss Marple said softly. "Seen anything new, dear? Anyone out of place?" Elsie hesitated, then whispered, "Last night I saw Mr. Grayson in the hall late. Near the library. He looked sneaky. But I didn't say nothing to the police. Don't want trouble." Miss Marple's needles clicked. "You're wise, Elsie. Thank you. Sneaky was a good word. Grayson in the library. Late. Another thread. Thin but bright. The morning dragged with rain, keeping everyone inside." Miss Marple wandered the house, her steps slow, her eyes sharp. The halls were grand, with chandeliers and rugs, but they felt cold, like a stage before the curtain rose. She passed the library, its door ajar. Inside, Grayson was pacing, a book in his hand but unopened. She slipped in, her shawl slipping. Slightly, "Oh, Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice gentle. "I didn't mean to startle you. Looking for something to read." He jumped, the book dropping. "It's Miss Marple. Yes, just browsing. This house has too many ghosts." He laughed, but it was thin like breaking glass. She smiled, picking up the Bucadol History of Art. "Ghosts or thieves," she said, handing it back. "The phantoms got us all jumpy." Grayson's face paled. "He's a devil, that one, slipping in, slipping out, no one's safe." "Perhaps," she said, her eyes soft but sharp. "But thieves leave traces. In my village, a man who stole tools always left sawdust. Small things, but they add up." Grayson swallowed, his hands twisting the book. "You're observant, Miss Marple." "Oh, I just noticed," she said, her needles clicking in her bag. "Like your cufflinks. Gold. But your cuffs are frayed. Hard times, Mr. Grayson." His eyes widened, then narrowed. "I do well enough. Art's a tricky business. That's all. Of course," she said, smiling. "I'll leave you to your reading." She left, her heart quickening. Grayson was scared, and scared men spilled secrets. At lunch, the mood was grim cold ham salad and tarts, eaten in silence. Charles was back to joking, but his eyes darted to Grayson, who ate little. Miss Price teased Lady Haverford about her jewels, earning a glare. Sir Henry pulled Miss Marple aside after. "Anything, Jane?" he asked, his voice low. She told him about Elsie's story and Grayson's late-night library trip. "It's hiding something, Henry, and he's afraid. Fear makes people careless." Sir Henry nodded. "Grayson's in deep with art dealers. If the phantom's selling stolen goods, he'd know the buyers." "Exactly," she said. "I'll watch him tonight. He's cracking." The afternoon was slow, with cards in the drawing room. Miss Marple joined her knitting in her lap. "Lady." Haverford played fiercely, her rings flashing. Miss Price chatted with Charles, her laugh too loud. Grayson sat alone, staring at his cards but not playing. Miss Marple caught Elsie's eye and smiled. "More tea, dear?" Elsie nodded, bringing the pot. As she poured, Miss Marple whispered, "Keep an eye on Mr. Grayson, Elsie. He's nervous. Might drop something." Elsie's eyes widened, but she nodded. Miss Marple trusted her servants saw everything. And Elsie was sharp under her shy shell. Dinner was grand roast beef, creamy potatoes, and wine that glowed in the candlelight. Charles was charming, spinning a tale about a London party. Price laughed, her earrings sparkling. Grayson drank heavily, his face red. Lady Haverford ate little, her eyes on her nephew. Miss Marple watched her soup cooling. Grayson's hands shook as he cut his meat, and he kept glancing at a servant, a young man with quick eyes. Interesting. After dinner. The guests moved to the ballroom for music. Miss Marple sat by a window, her knitting out, but her eyes followed. "Grayson." He slipped a note to the servant, who tucked it in his pocket and left. Miss Marple's needles paused. A note meant a plan, and plans meant trouble. She waited, then excused herself, saying she needed air. Instead, she crept to the library, where Elsie had seen Grayson. The room was dark, but a lamp flickered. Grayson was there alone, hunched over a desk. Miss Marple hid in the shadows, her shawl tight. He opened a buka hollow one with a ledger inside. His fingers flipped pages, his breath fast. She squinted, catching words. Emerald necklace, sapphire tiara, buyer in London. Her heart raced. Grayson wasn't the phantom he. Was the fence selling the stolen goods? Asterisk, he muttered to himself. They're pushing too hard. I can't keep up. Then he hid the ledger, closed the book, and left. Miss Marple waited, then slipped out. She'd seen enough. Grayson was the link to the buyers, but he wasn't the mastermind. His fear was too raw, his hands too shaky. The phantom was someone else, someone bold, with flair. Back in the ballroom, the music played on. Charles danced with Miss Price, his smile tight. Lady Haverford sat with Sir Henry, her fans snapping. Grayson returned, his face pale but composed. Miss Marple joined Sir Henry, her voice low. Grayson's fencing the goods. Henry, I saw a ledger in the library names items, buyers. He's scared, and scared men break. Sir Henry's eyes widened. Good Lord, Jane, that's a breakthrough. We'll get Craddock to search the library. Not yet, she said. We need the phantom, not just his helper. Grayson's a thread, but Charles is closer. And Miss Price, she's too sharp, too watchful. Sir Henry nodded. You're right. We watch, we wait. The evening ended, and Miss Marple climbed to her room, her steps slow. The house was quiet, but it thrummed with secrets. Grayson's ledger was a key, but it wasn't the lock. Charles's gloves, Elsie's footsteps, Miss Price's slyness, they were all pieces. In St. Mary Mead, she'd caught a thief by the jam on his shirt. Here, it would be something else a note, a glance, a glove. She locked her door and sat by the window, her knitting in her hands. The scarf grew longer, stitch by stitch. Outside, the mist was thick, hiding the garden. No shadows tonight, but they were there, moving. The phantom was close, and Miss Jane Marple was closer still. Chapter 6. The trap the fifth morning at Haverford Hall was bright, with sunlight cutting through the mist and painting the rose gardens gold. Miss Jane Marple woke early, her mind sharp as a needle. The phantom's web was tightening Charles, with his glove-ordering hands, Grayson with his secret ledger, and Miss Lavinia Price with her sly smiles. Last night's discovery in the library had lit a spark. Grayson was fencing the phantom's stolen treasures, but he wasn't the mastermind. The real thief was bolder, cleverer, and closer. Today, Miss Marple would set a trap to catch them. She dressed in her usual plain outfitted gray skirt, a white blouse, and her lavender cardigan, worn soft by time. Her sensible hat stayed on the dresser. She needed to blend in, not stand out. Her knitting, the pink scarf nearly done, went into her bag. The needles were her disguise, making her look like a harmless old lady while her eyes missed nothing. From her window, she saw a gardener clipping hedges, his movements calm. The house was a chessboard, and the phantom was a knight slipping through cracks. But knights could be cornered. Downstairs, the dining room was tense. The guests ate quietly, their spoons clinking. Lady Haverford sat like a statue, her coffee cold. Charles tried a weak joke about the sun, but his eyes were tired. Grayson nibbled toast, his hands twitching worse than ever. Miss Price, in a blue dress that caught the light, sipped tea and watched everyone, her lips curved. Sir Henry Clithering caught Miss Marple's eye and nodded. They'd talk soon. Breakfast was eggs, bacon, and scones, but the air was sour. Spectre, Craddock, still at the hall, joined them, his face grim. He mentioned the tiara theft, asking if anyone remembered new details. No one du jour said they didn't. Miss Marple spread butter on her scone, her eyes on Grayson. His fingers twisted his napkin into knots, and he avoided Craddock's gaze. Charles was too chatty, filling the silence with nonsense. Miss Price's smile was sharp. like a cat watching a bird. Small things, but they piled up. After breakfast, Miss Marple found Sir Henry in the hall. "We need a plan, Henry," she said, her voice low. "Grayson's the fence, but the phantom's the key. Let's bait them." Sir Henry's mustache twitched. "Bait? How?" "Spread a rumor," she said. "Say Lady Haverford's ruby brooch, reported stolen, was found. It's back in her safe, ready for the charity gala tomorrow. The phantom won't resist. He's proud, Henry. He'll want to prove he's untouchable." Sir Henry nodded, his eyes bright. "Clever Jane. If he bites, we catch him red-handed. I'll talk to Craddock and Lady Haverford." "Do it quietly," she said. "The phantom has ears. And watch the guests. Someone will flinch." The rumor was planted by noon. Sir Henry told Lady Haverford, who gasped loudly at lunch-cold chicken and fruit tarts on the terrace. "My ruby brooch," Say said, her voice carrying. "They found it in a pawn shop. It's back in my safe. Thank heavens. I'll wear it at the gala." The guests murmured, some relieved, some skeptical. Charles clapped his aunt's shoulder, his smile tight. Grayson dropped his fork, his face pale. Miss Price raised an eyebrow, her eyes flicking to Charles, then Grayson. Miss Marple sipped lemonade, watching. The bait was set. The afternoon was busy with preparations for the gala. Servants polished silver and hung lanterns in the ballroom. Miss Marple joined the ladies in the drawing room, her knitting in her hands. Lady Haverford fussed over her dress, a green silk gown. Miss Price sketched her pencil quick, but her eyes kept darting to the door. Grayson sat by a window, pretending to read, his fingers drumming. Miss Marple chatted with Elsie, the maid, who was dusting. "Big night tomorrow, Elsie," she said. "Lots of jewels out." Elsie nodded, her eyes wide. "Yes, ma'am. Everyone's talking about that brooch. Hope it's safe." "It will be," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "Keep your eyes open, dear. Someone might get bold." Elsie blushed, but nodded. Miss Marple trusted her servants were invisible to the rich, but they saw everything. Dinner was grand roast, duck, creamy potatoes, and wine that sparkled. The talk was all about the gala and the brooch. Charles joked that the phantom might crash the party, but his laugh was nervous. Grayson drank too much, his face red. Miss Price suggested hiring. Guards, her tone teasing, but her eyes hard. Lady Haverford snapped that her safe was enough. Miss Marple watched, her soup untouched. Charles's hands were quick, fidgeting with a spoon. Grayson's eyes kept flicking to the servant from last night, the one who'd taken his note. Miss Price's earrings caught the light, but her fingers drummed the table. After dinner, Sir Henry pulled Miss Marple aside. "The trap's ready," he said. "Craddock's men will watch the safe. The brooch is fake, a prop from Lady Haverford's jewelry box. If the phantom tries, we'll have him." "Good," she said. "But watch the guests, Henry. The phantoms. Not alone." Grayson's scared, Charles is jumpy, and Miss Price is too clever. "Someone will move tonight." Sir Henry nodded. "You're a marvel, Jane. Stay sharp." The evening was quiet, with music in the parlor. Miss Marple sat by a window, her knitting out, her eyes on the guests. Charles played cards with Miss Price, his smile forced. Grayson stood by the fireplace, his hands in his pockets. Lady Haverford retired early, saying she needed rest for the gala. Miss Marple waited, her needles slow. The house was a clock ticking toward midnight. Then it came, a flicker in the lights, just a moment. The music paused and the guests looked up. Miss Marple's eyes snapped to the hall, where a shadow moved. She stood, her shawl slipping, and signaled Sir Henry. He nodded, slipping out. She followed her steps, silent on the rug. The hall was dark, but a figure in a black cloak glided toward the staircase. Lady Haverford's room was up there, where the safe held the fake brooch. Sir Henry blocked the stairs, his voice sharp. "Stop right there." The figure froze, then turned to run. Craddock's men appeared, lanterns blazing. The cloak fell, revealing not Charles, but Miss Lavinia Price, her face pale, her eyes wide. The guests gasped, crowding behind. "Charles!" shouted Lavinia. "What's this?" Grayson shrank back, his hands shaking. Lady Haverford, summoned by the noise, clutched her robe, her mouth open. Craddock grabbed Miss Price's arm. "Explain yourself, miss." She yanked free her chin. "Hi, it's not what you think. I was checking the safe." "To protect the brooch," Sir Henry snorted. "In a cloak, at midnight." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft. "Miss Price, you're clever, but not clever enough. The brooch is fake, set to catch the phantom, and here you are." Price's eyes flashed, but her shoulders sagged. "You've got nothing," she snapped. "A cloak's not a crime." Craddock searched her, finding a small lockpick in her pocket. "This is," he said. "And we'll search your room." The guests were sent to the drawing room, where Craddock questioned Miss Price. Miss Marple sat in a corner, her knitting idle, her eyes sharp. Charles paced, his face pale. Grayson sat still, his hands clenched. Lady Haverford fumed, her fan. Snapping, Sir Henry whispered to Miss Marple. "Is she the phantom, Jane?" "Maybe," she said. "But I doubt it's that simple." She's bold, but the gloves point to Charles. "And Grayson's ledger ties him in. They're a team, Henry. She's just the one who tripped." Craddock returned, holding a pair of white gloves from Miss Price's room, no P, but fine leather. "Not the phantom's," he said, "but suspicious." "She's not talking yet." Miss Marple nodded. "She will." Pressure breaks even the toughest thread. The night ended with Miss Price under guard, the guests shaken. Miss Marple climbed to her room, her steps slow. The house was quiet, but it hummed with secrets. The trap had worked, but it wasn't the end. Miss Price was at peace, but Charles and Grayson were still in play. In St. Mary Mead, she'd caught a thief by the mud on his boots. Here it was gloves, ledgers, and a cloak. The phantom's web was unraveling, stitch by stitch. She locked her door and sat by the window, her knitting in her hands. The scarf was nearly done, pink and soft. Outside, the garden glowed under the moon. No shadows tonight, but they were there, hiding. The phantom was cornered, and Miss Jane Marple was closing in. Chapter 7. The confession, the sixth morning at Haverford Hall, was heavy, with clouds pressing low over the rose gardens. Miss Jane Marple woke early, her mind sharp despite the late night. The trap had sprung, catching Miss Lavinia Price in a black cloak, creeping toward Lady Haverford's safe. But the puzzle wasn't complete. Charles's gloves, Grayson's ledger, and Price's boldness wove a tangled web. And Miss Marple was determined to unravel it. Today, she'd pull the final threads, exposing the phantom's heart. She dressed in her usual plain clothes, a navy skirt, a cream blouse, and her lavender cardigan, soft and familiar. Her sensible hat stayed on the dresser. She needed to be invisible, a shadow among the shadows. Her knitting, the pink scarf nearly finished, went into her bag. The needles were her mask, making her seem harmless while her eyes caught every twitch, every lie. From her window, she saw a gardener sweeping leaves, his movements slow. The house was a storm about to break. And Miss Price's capture was the first THUNDERCLAP. Downstairs, the dining room was grim. The guests ate in silence, their forks barely touching plates. Lady Haverford sat like a queen, her face pale but her chin high. Charles slumped, his charm gone, his eyes red. Grayson nibbled toast, his hands shaking so badly he spilled his tea. Miss Price was absent, under guard in a guest room, watched by Inspector Craddock's men. Sir Henry Clithering caught Miss Marple's eye and nodded slightly. They'd talk soon. Breakfast was eggs, bacon, and rolls, but it tasted like dust. Craddock joined them, his notebook open, his face tired. He said little, only that Miss Price was uncooperative. The guests avoided his gaze, their silence loud. Miss Marple spread jam on her roll, watching Charles. His hands small and quick, were still clutching a napkin. Grayson's eyes darted to the door as if he might bolt. Lady Haverford's lips were tight, her coffee untouched. Small things, but they screamed of guilt and fear. After breakfast, Miss Marple slipped into the morning room where the ladies gathered. She took a corner chair, her knitting in her hands, and listened. Lady Haverford wrote letters, her pen scratching hard. Amid Elsie, the sharp-eyed one, brought tea, her face pale. Miss Marple smiled at her. "Hard morning, Elsie." Elsie nodded, pouring. "Full, ma'am." Everyone's whispering about Miss Price. Is she really the Phantom? Miss Marple's needles clicked. "We'll see, dear. Seen anything odd? Anyone sneaking about?" Elsie hesitated, then whispered, "Last night, before the fuss, I saw Mr. Charles near the West Hall. He looked worried, kept looking over his shoulder." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, Elsie. You're a good girl." Charles in the West Hall, near the safe. Another stitch in the pattern. The morning was tense, with rain tapping the windows. Miss Marple wandered the house, her steps slow, her eyes sharp. The halls were grand but cold, with portraits staring down. She passed the library, where ledger hid in a hollow book. She didn't enter. Craddock would search it soon, but she wanted the Phantom first. She paused by the West Hall, where Elsie had seen Charles. The safe was upstairs, in Lady Haverford's room. Charles, with his debts and gloves, was too close to the fire. At lunch. The mood was darker, cold beef, pickles, and tarts, eaten in silence. Charles barely ate, his eyes on his plate. Grayson muttered about leaving, his voice shaky. Lady Haverford snapped at a servant for a crooked napkin. Sir Henry pulled Miss Marple aside after. "Price isn't talking," he said. "Craddock's pushing, but she's stubborn." "What's your read, Jane?" "Just part of it," Miss Marple said, her voice low, "but not the head." Charles ordered the gloves. Grayson sells the goods. Price is the thief, but someone's pulling her strings. "Watch Charles. Henry. He's cracking." Sir Henry nodded. Craddock searching her room again, and the library, for that ledger. "Good," she said, "but don't spook them." Yet the Phantom's proud. "He'll slip if we push." The afternoon was slow, with cards in the drawing room. Miss Marple joined her knitting in her lap. Lady Haverford played fiercely, her rings flashing. Charles sat out, staring at a window. Grayson shuffled cards but didn't deal, his hands trembling. Miss Marple chatted with Elsie, who was dusting. "Any news, dear?" Elsie whispered, "The police found a note in Miss Price's room. Coded. They say Mr. Charles looked sick." When he heard, Miss Marple's needles paused. A coded note. Another thread, bright and strong. Dinner was grand roast lamb, creamy potatoes, and wine that glowed. But the talk was dead. Charles tried a joke, but it fell flat. Grayson drank. Heavily, his face red. Lady Haverford ate little, her eyes on her nephew. Miss Marple watched her soup cooling. Charles's hands were restless, twisting a spoon. Grayson's eyes flicked at Charles, then away. The air was thick, like before a lightning strike. After dinner, Craddock called everyone to the drawing room. Miss Price stood by the fireplace, her wrists cuffed, her chin high. Craddock held up a note, scribbled with numbers and letters. "Found in your room," he said. "Care to explain?" Price smirked. "It's nothing. A game." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "A game that lists stolen jewels and buyers. You're the Phantom, Miss Price." She laughed, sharp and cold. "You're grasping, Inspector. I'm no thief." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft. "You're clever, Miss Price, but not clever enough. The gloves ordered by Charles were your idea, weren't they? You used him to distract us while you slipped into safes. Grayson sold the goods, but you planned the jobs. The P isn't. For Phantom, it's for Price." The room went still. Charles gasped, his face white. Grayson sank into a chair, his hands over his face. Lady Haverford's fan stopped. Price's smirk faded, her eyes flashing. "You've got no proof." She snapped. Miss Marple smiled, her needles idle. The gloves, Miss Price, Mr. Hobbs, the tailor, described Charles' slim, dark-haired, scuffed shoes. He ordered them for you. And Elsie saw you in the West Hall, near the safe, before the tiara went. Grayson's ledger lists your hauls. You're bold, but you're caught. Price's shoulders sagged, her bravado cracking. She glared at Charles, then Grayson. Fools, she muttered. Then to Craddock. Fine. I did it. The necklace, the tiara, the rest. I planned every job. Charles, was my errand boy too soft to say no? Grayson fenced the goods, greedy as sin. But you'll never get it all back. Craddock nodded, his pen scratching. Why the gloves? Price's lips twitched. A flourish. I liked the game, and the P was mine, Price, not Phantom. You all made that up? Charles stood, his voice shaking. Lavinia, I didn't tie only helped because you said it was a prank. Price snorted. Grow up, Charles. You knew. Grayson moaned. I had no choice. She threatened to expose my debts. Miss Marple watched, her face mild. Price was the brain, Charles the pawn, Grayson the link. But something nagged her. Price's confession was too quick, too neat. Was she shielding someone? In St. Mary Mead, a thief had confessed to protect a lover. She filed it away. Craddock took Price away, and the guests scattered. Sir Henry pulled. Miss Marple aside. You did it, Jane. Cracked the Phantom. Not quite, she said. Price's part, but there's more. Charles knows something, and Grayson's ledger might name others. Keep digging, Henry. He nodded. Craddock's? Searching the library now. We'll get that ledger. The evening was quiet, with no music. Miss Marple sat in the parlor, her knitting out, her eyes on Charles. He paced, his hands in his pockets. Grayson sat alone, staring at the fire. Lady Haverford retired, her face gray. Miss Marple thought of Price's laugh, her bold eyes. She was the Phantom, but was she alone? The gloves, the ledger, the coded note, they fit. But the picture wasn't whole. She climbed to her room, her steps slow. The house was silent, but it thrummed with secrets. Price's confession was a knot untied, but others remained. Charles's fear, Grayson's ledger, Elsie's whispers, they were threads, and she'd weave them yet. In St. Mary Mead, she'd caught a liar by the sugar on his fingers. Here, it was gloves, notes, and a cloak. She locked her door and sat by the window, her knitting in her hands. The scarf was done, pink and soft. Outside, the clouds hid the moon. No shadows tonight, but they were there, waiting. The Phantom was down, but Miss Jane Marple wasn't done. Chapter 8. The Loose Ends. The seventh morning at Haverford Hall was quiet, with soft sunlight filtering through the rose gardens. Miss Jane Marple woke early, her mind still spinning from Miss Lavinia Price's confession. The Phantom was unmasked, her bold thefts laid bare, but the puzzle wasn't complete. Charles's shaky hands, Grayson's secret ledger, and a nagging doubt about Price's quick surrender kept Miss Marple's thoughts sharp. Today, she'd tie up the loose ends, ensuring no thread slipped through. She dressed in her usual plain clothes, a gray skirt, a cream blouse, and her lavender cardigan, soft from years of wear. Her sensible hat stayed on the dresser. She needed to blend in, not stand out. Her knitting, the pink scarf now finished and folded, stayed in her bag. The needles had served their purpose, making her seem harmless while her eyes caught every lie, every flinch. From her window, she saw a gardener raking leaves, his movements calm. The house was settling, but secrets lingered like dust in the corners. Downstairs, the dining room was subdued. The guests ate in near silence, their spoons clinking softly. Lady Haverford sat tall, her face pale but composed, her coffee untouched. Charles was absent, which made Miss Marple's fingers itch. Grayson nibbled a roll, his hands steadier but his eyes darting. Inspector Craddock, still at the hall, joined them, his notebook closed for once. Sir Henry Clithering caught Miss Marple's eye and nodded slightly. They'd talk soon. Breakfast was simple eggs, toast, and fruit, but the air was heavy. Craddock mentioned that Miss Price was in custody, awaiting transport to London. Her confession had named Charles as her helper and Grayson as her fence. But she'd given no details on the stolen goods locations. The guests avoided Craddock's gaze, their silence thick. Miss Marple spread jam on her toast, watching Grayson. His face was calm, but his fingers tapped the table, a nervous rhythm. Lady Haverford's lips were tight, her eyes distant, small. Things, but they whispered of unfinished business, daughter breakfast. Miss Marple slipped into the morning room where Lady Haverford was writing letters. She took a corner chair, her hands empty, and listened. A Medelsi, the sharp-eyed one, brought tea, her face tired. Miss Marple smiled at her. Long week, Elsie? Elsie nodded, pouring. Terrible, ma'am. Everyone's glad Miss Price is caught, but Mr. Charles, he's been odd. Locked in his room all morning. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. How dear? Elsie whispered, crying, I think. I heard him through the door, and he asked for a train schedule. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you, Elsie. You're a treasure. Charles crying and planning to run. A guilty heart or a scared one? The morning was calm, with a breeze rattling the windows. Miss Marple wandered the house, her steps slow, her eyes sharp. The halls were grand, with chandeliers and rugs, but they felt empty, like a stage after. The play she passed the library where Craddock's men had found Grayson's ledger last night. It listed stolen items, Lady Haverford's necklace and tiara, plus others from nearby estates and coded names of buyers. Grayson had confessed to fencing, claiming Price forced him, but he'd named no buyers yet. Miss Marple paused by the West Hall where the safe stood. The air was still, but it hummed with secrets. At lunch, the mood was lighter cold ham, salad, and apple pie. Eaten on the terrace, Grayson ate more, his shoulders relaxed. Lady Haverford spoke of the gala, cancelled after the trap. Craddock joined them, saying Price was still silent on the jewel's whereabouts. Miss Marple sipped lemonade, watching Grayson. His calm was new, almost smug. Had he cut a deal? She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a thief's brother turned informant to save his skin. Grayson was that kind, slippery, looking out for himself. Sir Henry pulled her aside after lunch. Jane, Craddock's got the ledger, he said, his voice low. It's damning names, dates, prices. Grayson's talking, hoping for leniency. Says Price planned everything, used Charles as a puppet, but we're no closer to the jewels. Miss Marple nodded. Grayson's a link, Henry, but Charles is the key. He's scared, maybe ready to bolt. Can Price's confession, it's too tidy. She's protecting someone or something. Sir Henry's mustache twitched. You think there's another player, maybe, she said. Or a bigger prize. Keep Craddock on Charles, he'll break. The afternoon was quiet with cards. In the drawing room, Miss Marple joined, her hands empty, her eyes sharp. Lady Haverford played fiercely, her rings flashing. Grayson read a newspaper, his face blank. Elsie whispered to Miss Marple while serving tea. Mr. Charles left his room, ma'am. He's in the garden with a suitcase. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Thank you, Elsie. Charles, running. She excused herself, saying she needed air, and slipped to the garden. The roses were bright, their scent heavy. Charles sat on a bench, a small suitcase at his feet, his head in his hands. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft. Charles, she said, her voice gentle. Going somewhere? He jumped, his face pale. Miss Marple. I just needed air. This house is suffocating. She sat beside him, her eyes soft but sharp. It's hard, isn't it? Helping Miss Price, knowing what she did. Those gloves, Charles, You ordered them for her, didn't you? His eyes widened, then dropped. I didn't know. She said it was a game, a joke. I got the gloves because she asked. I'm not a thief. Miss Marple nodded. I believe you, dear. But you knew. More than you said. Tell me, Charles. It's the only way. He swallowed, his hands shaking. She was so commanding. Said we'd make a fortune. Split it. I just ran Aaron's gloves notes. I never stole anything. When the tiara went, I panicked. She said to keep quiet, or I'd go to jail. Miss Marple's voice was calm. And the jewels? Where are they? He shook his head. I don't know. She never told me. Said it was safer that way. She patted his arm. Go to Craddock, Charles. Tell him everything. It's your best. Chansey nodded, tears in his eyes, and grabbed his suitcase. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind racing. Charles was a pawn, not the king. Price was the brain, but her quick confession still nagged. Was she shielding a buyer or a partner? Back inside, Craddock was in the library with Sir Henry, the ledger open. Miss Marple joined them, her voice low. Charles is coming to you. Inspector, he'll confess his part Aaron's gloves, nothing more. But Grayson's the key now. He knows the buyers. Craddock nodded, his pen scratching. Grayson's named to a dealer in London, another in Paris. We're tracing them. The necklace and tiara are likely sold, but we might recover others. Sir Henry grinned. You've done it, Jane? Price, Charles, Grayson all caught. Miss Marple shook her head. Not quite, Henry. Price confessed too fast. She's hiding something, a buyer maybe, or a bigger job. And the gloves, why leave them? Pride, yes. But there's more. Craddock frowned. You think she's got a partner? Possibly, she said. Or a plan we haven't seen? Keep pressing Grayson, he's weak. The evening was quiet with no music or cards. Miss Marple sat in the parlor, her hands empty, her eyes on Grayson. He was calm now, sipping brandy, his smugness back. Charles returned, pale but relieved after talking to Craddock. Lady Haverford stayed in her room, her anger spent. Miss Marple thought of Price's bold eyes, her sharp laugh. She was the phantom, but was she alone? The ledger, the gloves, Charles's. Tears they fit, but the picture was blurry. Craddock joined her later, his face tired. Grayson's talking, he said. Name 3 buyers. We've recovered a painting and some silver, but the necklace and tiara are gone. Charles confirmed Price's story errands, nothing more. It's not charged, but he's not free. Miss Marple nodded, and Price. Silent now, he said. Won't say where the jewels went. Claims she acted alone. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She didn't. In my village, a thief confessed to protect her brother. Price is covering for money or loyalty. Dig deeper, Inspector. Craddock nodded, leaving to question Grayson again. Sir Henry sat with Miss Marple, his voice low. You're not satisfied, Jane? No, she said. The phantom's caught, but the story's not done. Price's pride was her downfall, but there's a shadow behind her. We'll find it. The night ended, and Miss Marple climbed to her room, her steps slow. The house was silent, but it whispered of secrets. Price's confession, Charles's tears, Grayson's ledger, they were threads, woven tight. In St. Mary Mead, she'd caught a cheat by the flower on his hands. Here it was gloves, notes, and a cloak. The phantom was down and the jewels were traced, but a final knot remained. She locked her door and sat by the window, her knitting untouched. The scarf was done, pink and soft, a quiet victory. Outside, the garden glowed under the stars. Shadows tonight, but they'd been caught. The phantom's web was unraveled, and Miss Jane Marple had one.